guys, welcome back. Today I'm here with my August wrap-up. One thing that I do want to mention is that today's video is technically part of the blog booktube tour for one of my most anticipated books of the year. I did read it, I gave it 4.5 stars, and I talk about it in more detail later on in the video, but that book is Red Skies Falling by Alex London. This video is not a paid promotion, but I was sent an early copy of the book to review by Fierce Reads, which I really appreciate. Black Wings Beating was one of my favorite books of last year. I was very excited to read this one, and I am excited to tell you about it. Go pick it up. It's coming out really soon. I'm also going to be actually doing an interview with Alex London, which I'm excited about, so you guys will be getting that in a few weeks. But yeah, I will be talking more about this later on in the video. So August was a pretty interesting reading month for me. I read a lot of books. July was my lowest reading month in terms of quantity. August was one of my highest ones. I read 31 books in August, which is pretty wild. The other interesting thing about August is I gave out more low ratings than I usually do. Like, I have more low ratings in this month than maybe the rest of the year, which is pretty wild. So I read some not great stuff, some mediocre stuff, and some really fantastic things, so my ratings are quite a spread, which is interesting. So if you are new to my wrap-ups, the way that I always do this is I start out by talking about my statistics for the month, and then I talk about all of the books that I read, starting with my lowest rated books, moving up to my highest rated books. Of the 31 books that I read, 13 of them I read in the first half of August, and so those I talk about in more detail in my mid-month wrap-up, which I will link up above if you want to check that out. So for the books that I have already discussed in my mid-month wrap-up, I'm just going to tell you the name and the star rating, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. Otherwise, this video would be even longer than it's already going to be. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive into my stats for August. Like I said, I did read 31 books and graphic novels in August. I read 11,942 pages. That does include the audiobooks that I listened to. A lot of pages, definitely significantly up from last month. I did a lot of reading this month, guys. And part of it is that I'm really trying hard to get to my ARCs or advanced reader copies in a timely manner. And this month, I read a lot of them. 18 of the books that I read this month were ARCs. I think that is definitely my highest number for any month of the year. Definitely above average, but like I said, I'm really trying to get to things before they come out as much as I can, and hopefully you all appreciate that. Hopefully that's helpful to you in deciding like which books you're going to purchase as they're coming out. Moving on, let's talk about some of the goals that I set for myself. At the beginning of the year, my goal, some of which I've done better on than others, but my original goal was to read an average of 1 nonfiction book a month, 1 translated fiction book a month, and 1 indie published book a month. I have not been doing so well on the translated fiction, and again this month I did not read anything that was translated. However, I did read 1 indie book and 1 nonfiction book. This month I read 3 graphic novels. I read 9 books from my library. All of them were audiobooks. I had 2 DNFs, which means I did not finish those books for particular reasons, and I did not have any rereads this month. This month I listened to 12 audiobooks. Of those 12 audiobooks, 8 of them are what I call shelf books, which means that they are audiobooks that I listened to of books that were on my existing TBR shelf that got them off of my backlist TBR. One of those audiobooks was for a ARC or advanced reader copy that I have. And in terms of where those audiobooks are coming from, this month 3 of the audiobooks I listened to were from Scribd and 9 of them were from my library. In terms of age breakdown, this month I read 17 books that were targeted at an adult audience, 12 books that were targeted at a YA audience, and 2 books that were targeted at a middle grade audience. I'm pretty happy with this. In general, I'm shooting for at least a 50-50 split on adult versus YA, with some middle grade occasionally thrown in there, although it is a much smaller portion of my reading. Next, let's talk about genre. Genre breakdown is not too surprising. This is fairly typical for me. This month I read 10 fantasy books. I read 7 romance books, so a little more than usual in the romance category. I read 4 contemporary novels, 3 science fiction, 2 superhero, and then 1 each of horror, mystery, nonfiction, thriller, and literary fiction. As usual, a lot of fantasy, a lot of romance, and kind of a smattering of other genres. One other thing I don't normally talk about, but I do actually track in my spreadsheet that I use to track my reading, is the publication year of the books that I'm reading. And this month I was just kind of curious. I won't do this every month, although in my end of year statistics I will talk a little bit more about this, but I thought it would be interesting because I was reading so many arcs to look at the breakdown of like when things were published that I was reading. And this month, 21 of the books that I read are 2019 releases. So I'm reading a lot of front list right now. 2 of the books that I read were published in 2018, and then the other 8 were published prior to 2018, with the earliest publication year this month being 1992. So I just thought that was kind of interesting for those of you who are also data stats nerds like myself. Finally, let's talk about star breakdown. I did warn you, I had a lot more low-rated books than I usually do. This month I had 1 book that I gave 1 star to, 1 book that I gave 1.5 stars, 1 book that I gave 2 stars, 3 books that I gave 2.5 stars, 5 books that I gave 3 stars, 1 book that I gave 3.5 stars, 7 books that I gave 4 stars, 4 books that I gave 4.5 stars, 5 books that I gave 5 stars, and finally 3 books that I gave 6 stars. And in my personal rating scale, a 6-star read is a favorite of the year or a favorite of all time. It helps me sort of differentiate with the way that I rate books between books that are really solid, deserve a 5-star book, and a book that's really a favorite for me. So this month I had 3 books that were favorites. As you can see, like really interesting breakdown here. This is unusual. I tend to have a lot more 4- and 5-star reads clumped together than I did this month. I had way more than typical that I did not love, so we're gonna talk about those. It was a very interesting reading month. Okay, moving on, let's go ahead and talk about the books. Again, starting with my lowest rated books and moving up to my highest rated books. I will also briefly mention my DNFs. I had 2 of them this month, and both of them are books that I did discuss in more detail in terms of why I DNF'd them in my mid-month wrap-up, which is linked if you want to check it out. My first DNF was Rouge, a novel of beauty and rivalry by Richard Kirschenbaum. This one was sent to me for review. Unfortunately, did not work out so well for me. The other book that I ended up DNFing, really just for personal taste reasons that I get into in that other video, is The Misadventures of a Curvy Girl by Sierra Simone. Okay, moving on, let's talk about my 1-star read this month. This surprised me. I expected to like this book. It is an arc of a book. I had some issues with it. So this is Lean Out, The Truth About Women, Power, and the Workplace by Marissa Orr. I was really interested to pick this up because in general I do like books that talk about these issues of work and gender and power. This was kind of a mess. I think maybe if she had written it as being specifically about women working in like the corporate tech world, maybe it would have made more sense. Like she has some anecdotes about her time working at like Facebook and Google, but ultimately I just had a lot of issues with this. She is really pushing back on the lean in idea, which to be fair, I think has its own problems. The issue is that she then turns around and does the exact same sort of thing that she accuses Lean In of doing in terms of making a lot of assumptions based on her own experience about women's priorities and who they are and what they want. It also comes from a really, really privileged place to a point that I just like could not deal with. I talk about this more in my Goodreads review. If you guys want to check out my Goodreads, is always linked down below. I don't know that I want to go into too much detail of what exactly she does here, but it was not good. And also like it was not good. Like there were a few portions of it that were kind of interesting, but ultimately, yeah, this was definitely a 1-star read for me. And there were a few things specifically that I just was like, what? Like, oh my god. So yeah, this was kind of a mess, which was unfortunate because I was curious to read it. I was hoping I would like it, and I'm sure this will speak to some people. I also like, not only did I have problems with the way that she handled stuff, but also like I don't at all identify with her experience of working or of being a woman. Like, I'm like, that isn't me. And I'm fine with the fact that not all women are like me, not all women are also like her, and nobody's done a study on it, so we don't know what's typical. I don't know. Anyway, guys, I'm gonna stop because I could do a whole like rant thing on this, and I'm not. But if you want to hear more, read my Goodreads review. I talk more in depth about it. It was not good. So that was a bummer. Okay, let me look at my notes here. What do we have next? Okay. Moving on, I had a 1.5 star read. This was a e-arc that I had from NetGalley. It's called Just His Luck by BJ Daniels. This was romantic suspense, and this really did not work for me, which was unfortunate. I had read an earlier book in this series and enjoyed it. I think I gave it 4 stars, and so I wanted to try it out. This I found to be really annoying. It was too melodramatic. It had some weird writing conventions that didn't work for me. Clearly I'm in the minority because there are plenty of people who are reading this and giving it 4 and 5 stars and enjoying it, and so I think if like this is what you're looking for, it might be fine. For me, it just didn't really work. It's set during a 10-year high school reunion when the body of a classmate who disappeared on grad night is found, and they find out that she has been murdered. And so everybody's kind of together, and one of the classmates recently became sheriff, and so she is a suspect, could be a suspect, but is also investigating the murder. And there's just like all this over-the-top teen melodrama that comes to the surface. I was like, if I'm looking for this kind of melodrama, I will read something else. That's not really what I go to romance for, and so I just didn't particularly appreciate it. And there was this kind of weird convention where the ghost of the dead girl had a perspective, and it was an annoying perspective and an unnecessary one. So I just didn't really understand why this was done the way it was. Anyway, this didn't work for me. I gave it 1.5 stars, but your mileage may vary depending on your taste. Then I had a 2-star read, and okay, I probably should have known that this wouldn't be great, but I was really curious to see how this duology ended up going, because I had read the first book in it last year. This was another e-arc that I had from NetGalley, and it is The Raging Ones by Krista and Becca Ritchie. I think a sister writing duo, and this is the second book in a YA sort of sci-fi romance duology, and I had really mixed feelings about the first book. I think I gave it like 3 stars because it was good, but it felt like 2 very different but good books mashed together, and I had mixed feelings about it, but I was really curious to see where the second book in the duology would go. So I was like, you know what? I'm gonna read this because I want to see where it goes. I probably should have not, because like it wasn't really good. I didn't like the direction they took the characters. A lot of really bizarre things happened in here, and it sort of felt like throwing in a lot of things that are spoilery that didn't necessarily always make a whole lot of sense. It was also a little bit of a mess. So yeah, this one didn't really work for me. I should have known better, but I was curious, so I read it, and it was 2 stars. Okay, moving on, I had 3 books that I gave 2.5 stars this month. Like I said, like way more low-rated books than usual this month. The first one is one that I did talk about in my mid-month wrap-up, and that is The Furies of Calderon by Jem Butcher. So if you want to hear my thoughts on why I gave that one 2.5 stars, there are reasons, and I talk about it in depth in my mid-month wrap-up. But there were 2 others, and actually, interestingly, they are from the same author, who I have not read since I was a teenager, so clearly we seem not to be getting on. And that author is Meg Cabot. I really loved The Princess Diaries when I was young. I had not read anything else by her, and I was curious to do so, and I had 2 arcs from Book Expo by her. The first one is Black Canary Ignite. This is a middle grade graphic novel from DC Comics. Yeah, I found the main character to be kind of annoying. It was okay, like this wasn't terrible, but it wasn't really great either, and yeah, not my favorite thing. So that wasn't great. The other thing that I read, I actually did as a buddy read with Katrina from Fabulous Book Fiend, and we had pretty similar feelings on this book. I think she was kind and rounded it up to a 3-star, but neither of us really liked this. This is No Judgments, and it's coming out September 19th. And again, it's kind of a mess. The pacing of this book is very strange, and the characters feel kind of flat and underdeveloped. It is an adult romance novel that is supposed to take place during a hurricane. And so one of the weird things about this is the pacing. So I had assumed that most of the action would take place during the hurricane, which would make sense for a book that you build tension along with the hurricane. I was like, that's a cool idea, you know, like leading up to the hurricane, then all the major action happens during the hurricane, and then you get kind of the denouement afterwards. That is not what this did. It was very strange. So, like, all these things happen, the hurricane happens, and it's really not that big of a deal, and then, like, the climax of it happens after the hurricane, and a lot of weird things happen. The pacing was very strange. I don't know quite why she chose to do it the way that she did. Also, the male love interest is pretty controlling and kind of an alpha male in ways that weren't appealing. Like, I didn't really necessarily want the characters together at the end of it. There were also some very odd choices made, like probably maybe my favorite, but also least favorite. I don't know. Like, there's a scene in the book that I liked in some ways where the main female character confronts a man who had attempted to sexually assault her. And there's also a lot of content warnings in this also, so check my Goodreads review if you want to see what those are. But yeah, she confronts him, which is great, except she does it with a gun and she like shoots a tequila bottle, and like that was a choice. It was like an odd choice. This was just a very odd book. Like I don't understand a lot of the choices in terms of pacing. I didn't really care about the characters. It wasn't great. So 2.5 stars. Sadly, I seem not to be getting on so great with Meg Cabot, at least in these instances. Maybe I should try something else by her at some point, but this just didn't really work so well for me. Okay, moving on, let's talk about my 3-star reads. 2 of the books that I gave 3 stars to, I did talk about in my mid-month wrap-up. The first one is The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren, and the other one was super disappointing just because this was a highly anticipated book for me. That is Deviant by Jay Kristoff, book 2 in the Lifelike series. So Lifelike was one of my favorite books last year. This was fine. It was very underwhelming, which was unfortunate, but I do talk about that in more depth in that other video. I had 3 other books that I gave 3 stars to this month. The first one is one that I've been meaning to get around to reading for quite a while. I'm happy I finally did, and I have mixed feelings on it. I don't know. This is Roar by Cora Carmack. I do have an arc of Rage, which is the second book in the series that just came out, which is part of why I wanted to read the first one. I have a lot of friends who really, really love this. And number one, I don't think I realized this is a fantasy romance. A lot of people talk about how cool the magic system and the world is, and actually I will say that is one of the things that is stronger in this book that I did really like, is I do think the magic system is really interesting and different to do with like storms, and I really enjoyed that. I thought that was really well done. But if you are expecting like an epic fantasy, that is not what this is. Like, the romance is definitely the main plot of this book, which is fine. I do like fantasy romance. It's just a thing that for whatever reason, I don't know why I wasn't really expecting that. Like, initially I was thinking maybe this would be like a 4-star read, like where it had some good things going for it, and the characters were interesting. It was fine. The thing is, though, that the more that I thought about it, the more problems I have with her relationship with the male love interest. Again, it's this thing of him being this like hyper alpha male. He's kind of controlling, and it's to a fairly unhealthy degree in my opinion. And also, this came out in 2017, which is not that long ago, and this does this thing that I'm like, why are we still doing this in YA, of kind of idealizing female virginity. There's like this whole thing near the end of the book where he like finds out that she's never even kissed anybody, and he's the first guy to kiss her, and he's like, oh, I can't believe it, I'm the first man to kiss these lips, and no one else will ever have this. And it was very like, it was weird. It was very weird, guys. And I was like, oh, okay though, like, and he's like, well, then I have to take it slow and make sure it's a great experience, which I'm like, that's fine, but also like, can we not like, and then he gets all weird and jealous about stuff. I don't know. There were a lot of things like that I was like, okay, why are we doing this in YA right now? But there were things I liked about it, so I'm curious. I will probably try the second book of the series, see how I feel about it. I understand better now why some of my friends like it as much as they do, because they love this sort of romance. But as a romance for teenagers, I'm not thrilled with the relationship. But yeah, I do think that like the storm magic element of it is cool, and I did find a lot of it to be fairly enjoyable, although it definitely dragged in the middle for me. So yeah. My final 3-star read for August was my indie published book that I read this month. This was very kindly sent to me by the author, who's also a follower of the channel. I really appreciate her sending this to me for review. It was not entirely my cup of tea, I think, but I'm glad that I read it and I appreciate the opportunity. This is Child of the Kaites by Beth Wangler. So this is Christian fiction fantasy. It is a kind of gender-flipped reimagining of Moses and the Exodus story. I think for a few reasons this was like less what I was hoping for, but I could see this really working for some people depending on what you prefer in your fantasy. One thing about this is that I wasn't expecting is that a very large middle chunk of the book is sort of this like traveling band type of fantasy where they're like traveling around and having little mini adventures, and that's a hard sell for me. Like I rarely enjoy that type of fantasy. Sometimes I do, but usually there has to be like specific reasons for it, and in this case it wasn't my favorite thing to read. The last portion of the book was more what I was kind of interested in and hoping for, the last like 150 pages or so, which is the actual sort of like plagues leading up to the Exodus. And so I guess for my personal taste, I would have preferred to have more of that, more development of the sort of political backstory of what's going on there. And that just wasn't really what this was, which is fine. Like, I think she's got some really interesting ideas here, and there's like spirits and stuff. One other thing to be aware of is, like I said, this definitely solidly is falling in like Christian fiction fantasy, in that a lot of it is like pretty directly allegorical, kind of in the way of like a C.S. Lewis type thing. And so I think some people are really going to love that. I think if you're looking for something that has a lot of like sort of thoughtful places unpacking Christian spirituality in the context of a fantasy book, talking about like forgiveness and different types of things that kind of get put in here in different places, you might enjoy this. That's definitely what this does. And there's also like definitely some direct analogies. There's these spirits that are called the Kaites, and they're clearly supposed to be kind of like angels. And then I can't think of what they're called now, but then the Kaites or something, something else with a similar name that's clearly supposed to be like demons. And so there's a lot of like allegorical stuff. I think a lot of this is done pretty well. It was a little bit of a slow start for me, but once I got into it, I did really care a lot about some of the characters. Sadly, some of my favorite characters you don't have through that whole middle portion of the book, and then they come back at the end. So I think in book 2 you probably get some of them again. Anyway, all that to say, this was 3 stars for me. I really appreciate the opportunity to read it. If that sounds interesting to you and you want to support an indie author, definitely go and check it out. Unfortunately, it wasn't like quite my cup of tea, so I gave it 3 stars. And my final 3-star read was another e-arc that I got from NetGalley. This was Dear Haiti, Love Alaine by Maika and Maritza Moulite. Okay, so I don't know what to say about this one. It's one of those things where there are things that I love about this, but then a lot of things that I found to be really, really frustrating about this book. It's a little messy. Messy seems to be the word of the day. But I love the representation it's offering. So you may be wondering what this is. Dear Haiti, Love Alaine is a debut YA contemporary novel that is told in epistolary format, which means it's told through a collection of diaries and letters and journal entries and documents. And I think the concept behind this was an interesting one in terms of this supposedly being like a school project that Alaine is handing in. But ultimately, I'm not sure I'm really sold on this as a format that worked for this story. It ended up feeling a little bit like gimmicky and trying to force certain things into it that didn't always work super well. So I didn't love the way that the format was done, even though in general I do like epistolary books. I'm not sure it worked so well in this case. That said, the main thing about this book is I just think it was trying to do too many things, and I think that's kind of unfortunate because a lot of the things it was trying to do are really great things and important things. A lot of this is really deeply rooted in Haitian history and culture and tries to get at a lot of really deep and important issues about gender, about political corruption, about having a loved one deal with early onset dementia, child sexual abuse, just a lot of different issues, and way more than that even, like cultural identity and immigration and gender, and just there's a lot. I think probably too much. If you want to hear more details, maybe check out my Goodreads review. It might be a little bit more coherent. And again, my Goodreads is always linked below if you want to read my review. But I think maybe the focus should have been narrowed. Colonialism, there's a lot of that. There's like toxic masculinity, like there's so many things. But I think it was too much. Also, I think in terms of genre, it wasn't quite sure what it was trying to be. And as a reader, that was a really frustrating experience. In some ways, this felt like 3 different books kind of mashed into one, but not in a way where they were seamlessly woven together. It starts off, Alaine has a really strong voice as a character, and so this book starts off feeling like kind of a lighthearted comedic YA, and I loved Alaine as a character, and her voice and her sarcasm is really entertaining. But then we start getting these more serious issues pulled into it, like early onset dementia of a loved one, like child sexual abuse. And in those cases, the tone sometimes felt a little bit off. I understand that Alaine as a character uses humor as kind of a coping mechanism, but even given that, sometimes her sort of like sarcastic tongue-in-cheek approach to talking about these things felt a little inappropriate, given the gravity of the issues that were being handled. So that was sometimes a little off. And then later on in the book, you get this, things take kind of a weird turn where it throws in like a family curse and voodoo and dark blood magic, and like I don't really know where it was going with all of that or why that was there, and it read like it was maybe supposed to be more like a mystery thriller, which totally didn't fit with the rest of what the genre was doing, and it was strange. It was a very strange choice and frustrating as a reader, which is unfortunate because I think this is a group of people in a culture that is really underrepresented in YA, so I'm glad this was published, and I do think there's a lot to like here, but the execution was messy. So I really hope that we see more from these writers in the future. I would love to see them come out with something that deals with a smaller subsection of the things that they were trying to do here, because I think these are important voices to have in the YA community, but yeah, messy. Messy seems to be the word of the day, and this was kind of that. So yeah, mixed feelings. This ended up being 3 stars. Then this month I had one 3.5-star read, and this is a book that has been on my TBR for a while. And one of my friend Amanda over at the Naughty Librarian actually sent this to me as a gift because this is one of her favorite series. I don't know how I feel about it. It's an odd book, so let's talk about it. This is The Bone Witch by Chupeco. Okay, so it wasn't really quite what I expected, and I did like it. There were a lot of things that I really liked about it, and I'm glad that I read it, but it's very strange. This sort of reads like Memoirs of a Geisha, except with necromancy and more death. Like, it's kind of odd. It is the first in a YA fantasy series that definitely feels very unique, and I did appreciate that a lot. Chupeco is from the Philippines, and I think a lot of that mythology kind of works its way into here, and I do appreciate that we had a series by a non-Western author that has done pretty well. So I'm really happy that I read this. I think the world is really beautiful. A lot of the writing is really good. This is, though, a very, very slow-paced book, and it's not going to be for everyone. This is where it reminds me a lot of Memoirs of a Geisha, is much of this book takes place while Taya, the Bone Witch, is in this kind of training school for Asha, or witches. And the Asha do magic, but they also are sort of like geishas in that they entertain and they perform dances and play music, but they can also fight. And so there's a lot about the detailed sort of minutia of day-to-day life and training and learning in these things, and like it's very, very detailed. I mean, the world building is fantastic, but it is very slow paced. I don't necessarily always mind slow paced books, but this definitely dragged a bit for me. And it's also interesting because in terms of structure, it's more akin to like a Name of the Wind, not in style or content so much, but it is the Bone Witch years later telling her story to someone else. And so you get these like interruptions every like couple chapters where they'll have some kind of a little mini interaction, and then you go on to her sort of telling her backstory. So yeah, it was definitely an interesting experience. I can for sure see why some people did not like this. If you don't like a Memoirs of a Geisha type thing, where it feels almost like it could be a historical fiction, it's like a slower paced thing with a lot of detail and a lot of sort of like minutia of what's happening, you probably won't enjoy this. If you need a really plot-driven book, this is not going to be the book for you. I don't know, it was even a little too slow for me, maybe, but I'm curious. Let me know if you have read on in the series, if things pick up at all in the second book. Like, I might be open to trying it. It's definitely different though, and unlike anything else, and so I'm really happy for Chupeco that she's done so well with it. So yeah, 3.5 stars. I had like mixed feelings on it, and it was just not what I expected. Next, let's talk about my 4-star reads. I had 2 of them that I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. The first one was the Patreon book club pick of the month, and that was The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This was a beast of a book. Gave it 4 stars. And the other one I talked about in that video is Inspection by Josh Malerman. Then I had 5 other 4-star reads, and 2 of them are graphic novels. First up, I read Superman of Smallville by Art Baltazar and Franco. This is another middle grade DC Comics graphic novel, and this one I really enjoyed a lot. I thought it was really funny and entertaining, and something that I think a lot of kids in this age group, especially for the younger middle grade audience, might really enjoy. It is a standalone superhero kind of backstory where he is in middle school and like crushing on a girl and getting grounded and like dealing with things, and it's just really funny and silly. And you know, like reading reviews, there are some adults that are like, this was terrible, but because they're not the right target audience, and like they're like, this isn't the Superman I know. I'm like, well, okay. So it's silly, it's fun. It's for a middle grade audience. I would say like 7 to 10-year-olds would probably get a kick out of this and enjoy it. I thought it was fun. And then the other graphic novel that I gave 4 stars to is one that I think is going to be really polarizing, but I mostly really liked it. This is The Black Mage by Daniel Barnes and DJ Kirkland. So this is sort of like Get Out meets Harry Potter. It's really funny. I enjoyed this. I understand that like some people might find this like offensive, but I thought it was good, and especially because the author is a person of color, like he can do this. If you guys haven't seen it, Get Out is a film that is kind of like a comedy horror about racism, and this is very similar. If you've seen Get Out, this is very similar, except plus Harry Potter, because it's set at like a magical boarding school with like the first supposedly the first Black Mage going there. It is definitely very overt in the way that it pokes fun at racism and the KKK, and I think it's entertaining. I think it is very much in the tradition of this type of Black humor from within the Black community that has happened. I do think that there are probably some white people who will feel really uncomfortable with this, but I enjoyed it. It wasn't perfect. I think sometimes it was a little over the top. It could have stood to be a little bit more developed than it was, and it's a little silly, but also I liked it, so I gave it 4 stars. I also gave 4 stars to a book that I ended up enjoying a lot more than I thought I would. This was something that I picked up because I'm going to be getting a physical copy for promotion on Instagram from Harlequin, and they sent me the NetGalley link for it. This is Shelter from the Storm by Patricia Davids. Not something I would typically read, but like I said, I ended up liking this more than I thought I would. It was like just the moment where I needed it. This is an Amish romance with a marriage of convenience plot. If you'd been wondering, yes, this is a subgenre of romance that exists. It is like clean romance, so there's never sex or anything in these books. It's more just really sweet, and sometimes that can get kind of weird, but in this case it really worked for me and I really enjoyed it. This one is a marriage of convenience plot with a girl who is pregnant. One thing you have to go into this knowing and just like going with is that due to their sort of conservative religious and cultural beliefs in the Amish community, if you are pregnant out of wedlock, it is taken very, very seriously. You have the potential of even being kind of like thrown out. So like there's a lot of conversation that happens around that, and there's a guy who was sort of her childhood crush who offers to marry her because she is pregnant, and he is a darling and a sweetheart, and this was very heartwarming. I really loved it. The thing that I thought was kind of cool about this is that in some ways this is a love letter to NICU nurses. I just thought was really beautiful. Obviously, that means there are going to be some content warnings here for having a baby who needs to be in neonatal intensive care. that is there, but I ended up really enjoying this. It was a really sweet story and kind of what I needed at the moment. The next book that I gave 4 stars to is one that is highly anticipated for a lot of people, and I did really enjoy it. This is There Will Come a Darkness by Katy Rose Poole. I may actually do an individual review video for this just because I have a lot to say about it and a lot of thoughts. Overall, I do think this is a good debut. I think it's got a lot going for it, but I also think it's not a perfect book. I did really enjoy it. I also did a video where I made book recommendations for each of the 5 main characters in the book, which was really fun to do, and we'll tell you a little bit more about who the main characters are, which I will link up above if you guys want to check that out. But this is a YA epic fantasy. It has 5 perspective characters, as I mentioned, and it involves prophecy. It is loosely inspired by the ancient Mediterranean area. I think this does diversity really, really well in a lot of different ways. Again, I think I'm going to make an individual video talking more in depth about this, but I do talk about this in my Goodreads review, which you can always get to down below. It had some kind of plot holes, and the character development could have been more in depth, but I did enjoy it. It's got a very cinematic feeling to it, and I could see this doing very well commercially. So yeah, I would recommend it. I did enjoy it, even if it wasn't like a new favorite book. I definitely liked it and do plan on continuing on with the series. And my final 4-star read is actually the last book that I finished in the month. This is Coming Home for Christmas by Rayanne Thane. I had a e-arc of this on NetGalley, and then I was sent this copy for review by Little Bird Publicity. It's really beautiful, really pretty. I ended up enjoying this a whole lot, more than I thought I would. I don't know why I keep saying that, but I would say if you were looking for a somewhat angsty Hallmark movie style Christmas romance that also highlights the seriousness of postpartum depression, check out Coming Home for Christmas. I really appreciated the way that this handled serious issues and did it really well. Specifically, one of the things that it deals with is severe postpartum depression, which postpartum depression is something that a lot of women experience, and it's something that is not talked about enough. I myself experienced this to some degree, although definitely not to the level of severity of the main character in this book. But it is definitely something that I experienced, and it's not something that's often talked about, and this is just handled so well. It's done with such compassion and with an eye to what are the different things that you can do to make sure that you have good mental health and the importance of that, especially as a parent. And so I loved that. It also, I think, does a really good job of dealing with disability and chronic illness in some different ways. In terms of the story that we have here, it is a second chance romance. It is about a woman who has run away from her husband and 2 small children. She's dealing with severe postpartum depression, including suicidal ideation and thoughts of harming her child, and she runs away, so trigger warnings for that, guys, but she runs away to try to keep them safe. Some things happen, and she ends up disappearing. And 7 years later, her husband tracks her down and brings her back to prove that he's innocent of her suspected murder. And then they kind of reconnect. And so it's what happened, where has she been, why has she been gone for 7 years? And it's about this slow kind of rekindling of this love that they had. And also her reconnecting with her children, who are obviously much older. That also I thought was handled really well. Sometimes in this sort of book, everything's kind of like sunshine and rainbows, and easily everybody forgives everything and they reconnect quickly. That is not the way that this is done, particularly with her older child, her daughter. There's a lot of like stuff that needs to get worked through in terms of therapy and a lot of time. And so I just thought a lot of this was handled really well. It's a really great romance, and it kind of grows on you with time. I wasn't sure at the beginning how I was going to feel about it, but I ended up really liking it a lot. I will say some of the plot points are over the top and unlikely to actually be true, which is part of why this was 4 stars, and it is more angsty than I think I usually enjoy all that much, but I did really like it, and I think for the issues that it's addressing, it does them really well. So if that sounds appealing, go check out Coming Home for Christmas. Moving on, let's talk about my 4.5-star reads. 2 of them I did talk about in my mid-month wrap-up video. The first one is American Royals by Katherine McGee. One thing that I do want to add on to what I said in my mid-month wrap-up is apparently, one of the things, I talk about the fact that, I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but I talk about in my mid-month wrap-up the fact that the main thing that kept this from being a 5-star read for me, and to be fair, this is not going to be the book for everyone, but I did enjoy it. But the thing that kept it from being a 5-star read for me is the fact that it never once addressed slavery or Native Americans. I go into more detail again in that other video. Update that I wanted to make is apparently the publisher is saying that they had heard those concerns and that in the final version of this book that is addressed. I have not read it. I read an ARC copy where it wasn't, and so I don't know exactly how they handled those, but in case you're wondering, that's what they've said. I am very curious to read the finished copy and see how and if it's different. And if it is done particularly well, I could see this ending up being a 5-star read for me, but I don't really know. So at least in its ARC form, this was 4.5 stars, but I wanted to say that just because it was like a big issue. And the other one I talked about in that video is His Hideous Heart, edited by Dahlia Adler. This is 13 short stories by YA authors inspired by the works of Edgar Allan Poe. Okay. And then I had 2 other 4.5-star reads. The first one is Vision in Silver by Anne Bishop, book 3 in the Other series. And actually, I'll just talk about this now. Earlier in the month, I read Murder of Crows, which is book 2. I did talk about this one in my mid-month wrap-up. This one was 5 stars for me. This one was 4.5. I still really loved it. This is right now probably one of my favorite series, and I'm really enjoying it. It's a paranormal series, a little bit older paranormal series. There's 5 books in it, so I'm kind of like pushing my way through them. I love the characters. I love the world so much. This one wasn't quite a 5-star read for me, partly because I think as the middle book in the series, there was a lot of plot points happening and taking over, and so we get fewer of the sort of sweet moments with Meg and with Simon that I love so much in the other books. You do still get some of them, but not quite as much. So I still enjoyed this. I'm still loving the series, but I didn't love it quite as much as the other one. So this one was 5 stars, talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. This one was 4.5, and I do plan on continuing on. So maybe I'll finish the series in September. Who knows? I'm really, really loving them. Written Red was the first book, and it was one of my favorite books of last year. And my final 4.5-star read this month was one of my most anticipated books of the year. This is Red Skies Falling by Alex London, the sequel to Black Wings Beating. I liked this a whole lot. Black Wings Beating was one of my favorite books that I read this year. It's kind of an all-time favorite for me. And Red Skies Falling is a very different sort of book, which in some ways is unsurprising given the way that we leave off at the end of Black Wings Beating. I did still really like it. I think it does a lot of things really, really well, but I didn't love it quite as much. And I still don't know how I feel about the ending. Like, there's a pretty epic ending, and I don't know. Like, I don't know how I feel about it. But this is the second book in a trilogy, so I'm curious to see what happens in the final book in the series. Series that follows twin siblings, a brother and a sister. They are the main characters. I really like them, and I like the way that they're handled. In the first book, they're together for much of the book. In this book, they are separated for much of the book. And I think that's really important. I think the character work in this book is so good and so well done. They both have these really strong arcs of character development where they grow apart from each other in really important and necessary ways. This is also Own Voices for gay representation. The brother in the sibling relationship is gay, and he does have a romance that develops in this story. I think it's handled really well. And the sister is asexual, aromantic, which I also think is, I'm not those things, but I think from what I can tell, I think it's handled really well, and I love that it escapes some of these negative stereotypes of aro ace people being like cold or not having close relationships or desires, and that just isn't true. And so I think this is done really well. It's very clear that she has zero interest in romantic or sexual relationships, but she has really deep friendships and people that matter a lot to her. And part of the story is her really finding who she is and what she wants out of life and who she wants to be, and I just think that's really great. She is a fantastic character, so if you've been looking for that kind of representation, I think Kylie is great for that. I think the world building is fantastic. There's so much detail and thought put into this. This is set in a world where everything is kind of based on falconry and birds of prey and how people respond to those birds of prey, and it really informs the culture in a lot of different ways. I think it's really well done and so detailed, and clearly he did a ton of research. The character work is fantastic. There's also a lot of, the thing that I love, morally gray characters in here, and even the sort of villains are not clear-cut villains. They have reasons for what they do, and like you're kind of set to question like, well, are they right or are they wrong? Are our main characters making the right choices or the wrong choices? And maybe both sometimes. So I think it's just really good. It's a really underhyped series. I feel like it's sort of flown under the radar, but it's very well done. So yeah, really enjoyed this. I think more people should read it. Oh man, guys, this is like the longest wrap up I filmed in a while. Even with my mid-month wrap up, I just read so many books and I have so much to say about them. I need to, okay. We can do this, we can do this. 5-star reads are next. 3 of my 5-star reads are books that I did talk about in my mid-month wrap-up. The first one was Murder of Crows, which I already mentioned. I also talked in that video about The Death of Mrs. Westaway by Ruth Ware, and Let's Call It a Doomsday by Katy Henry. So if you want to hear more of my thoughts on those books, go check out the mid-month wrap-up. Then I had 2 other 5-star reads this month. The first one I do not own a copy of, but I want to, so I may go buy it. This I listened to on audio from my library. It is one of Tess Adair's backlist books. It's A Week to Be Wicked, and I loved it. I think this might be now my new favorite Tess Adair book that I have ever read. It made me laugh out loud, and it was just fantastic. And this, along with some other romances that I've read this month, have made me come to realize something, that my catnip in romance is nerdy characters. Like whether it's the girl or the guy or both of them, I love nerdy romance so much, and we're going to talk more about this as we move on in this wrap up. But yeah, this was fantastic. This is a Victorian historical romance, and our heroine is a blue stocking, which means she's kind of a nerd. She's very bookish. She is a geology nerd, and she wants to go present this paper on geology, but because she's a woman, she can't be traveling by herself, and so this rake with a bad reputation ends up traveling with her, and things happen during the week. And it is funny, it's sexy, it's just really, really good. It's totally the kind of romance I enjoy, and there was like nerdy humor in it. It was just like top notch, guys. Top notch historical romance. Give me more of that, please. So yeah, highly recommend A Week to Be Wicked by Tess Adair, and the audiobook is really good. And my final 5-star read of the month is one that has been on my TBR for a really long time, and I'm so happy that I finally read this. This is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This has been all over BookTube. Like, do I need to tell you what it's about? I knew that I was going to enjoy this book. I had a feeling based on the way people talked about it. But it's so rich, and it just does so many things incredibly well. This is one that I feel like you could easily pull quotes from, and it's so smart. It's about an aging movie star from the golden age of Hollywood, and she is telling her life story for the first time to this kind of nobody reporter, and they've worked out kind of a deal. And she is known for having had 7 husbands, but the great love of her life was actually a woman, and so she is bisexual. And I think this is great in terms of dealing with bisexual erasure and the way that bisexual people are often seen as not valid from within the queer community and also from within heterosexual community, and that's handled really well. It also really gets into the realities of what it was like to be a woman, an ambitious woman, and particularly an ambitious woman of color in this world in like the 1950s and 60s, because Evelyn Hugo has a lot of ambition, but she is Cuban, and she dyes her hair blonde to fit in, and she changes her last name so that it doesn't sound Cuban. And it's about the things that she does and the choices that she makes as a woman in terms of using her body and sexuality to get where she wants to go. And is like, you know, hey, like, this is what I have to do. And I love Evelyn Hugo as a character. She's so complicated, and you can't like pin her down into one thing. I also really liked the character, I can't think of her name right now, but the girl who's interviewing her that she's telling her life story to. I think between the two of them, we get a really interesting look at cultural identity and passing for white and what that means in different contexts. And yeah, it's really, really good and really rich, and addresses like toxic masculinity. It's fantastic. I really loved it. This is one of those ones where I'm like, is it 5 stars or 6 stars? I don't know. I think I read this book when I was kind of just barely coming out of a reading slump, and I it's something where I feel like maybe if I had read it at the right time, this could have been a favorite book of the year, and maybe it should be. I'm kind of going to sit on it. It's one where I feel like if I reread it, it could end up being a favorite book because I did really love it, and I think there were so many things that were incredibly well done. I think my enjoyment level wasn't as high as I usually want it to be for a favorite book of the year, but I don't know. Like this is like the one that's like on the fence of like this could be 6 stars, which I've said before about books that have ended up making on the shelf. And then there's ones that later on I'm like, I don't know, is it really still a favorite? So you may end up seeing this on my favorites list. I don't know, but it was definitely a 5-star read. I think this is an important book. It's a well-written book, and yeah, anyway, really loved it. Whew. Man, guys, it's hot in here. Okay, so moving on, we just have my 6-star reads to talk about. There are 3 of them this month. Maybe 4, we'll see. But definitely 3 of them, which is great. So like, even though I had some books that were really terrible that I read, I also read some really, really fantastic ones, which is awesome. So 2 of these books, I actually have individual review videos for them, which should tell you something. The first one is Serpent and Dove by Shelby Mahurin. This one is coming out soon. I've pre-ordered my finished copy. I'm very excited to own it. This is not necessarily a perfect book, but the romance is so freaking good. I had to put it on my favorites list. One of my favorite romances I've read this year, and also everything else about it is really solid also. So if you guys want to hear more detailed thoughts about this and see if this is going to be the right book for you, check out my review of it. But yeah, this one was 6 stars, favorite of the year, going on my favorites shelf. The other one that's a favorite for me that I did make a full review video for, which again I will link up above, is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. Very, very interested to see how this does when it comes out. This one is also coming out in September, really, really soon. Very excited for it. I think this is going to be a pretty polarizing book, much like Jay Kristoff's Nevernight. I think there's going to be a lot of people who are going to absolutely love this, and then some people that are not going to get it, and some people that are going to hate it, and I think that's fine. I loved it. Everything about this really worked for me. One thing to note that I feel like not a lot of people are saying about this book is that it is actually a closed circle mystery combined with like a sci-fi fantasy story. So do be aware of that going in, because I feel like the way this book is being pitched is lesbian necromancers in space, which is true, but also maybe doesn't quite set up your expectations for what this book actually is. Yeah, but I loved it. It's a favorite for me. So there we go. And the final book that I gave 6 stars to is another romance, and yeah, definitely this is an all-time favorite romance for me, guys. I loved it. This is Well Met by Jen DeLuca. I love this so much. It is her debut. I'm really excited to see what else we get from her because this is freaking amazing. It is an adult romance set at a Renaissance fair, and again, you have 2 nerdy main characters. It's hate to love. This is totally my jam. It made me so happy. I smiled so much with this book. It made me really happy. It's freaking awesome, and I love the nerdiness of it. I would really love to see Jen DeLuca write one that takes place at like a con, like a Comic-Con. I need that. Like, I loved Geekerella, but I want like a grown-up Geekerella or something like that, you know? Like, I need that in my life. That would be great. But this was really, really cool. It's about a woman who volunteers to work at a Renaissance fair because her teen niece wants to be there and she needs a adult to volunteer with her. And she kind of doesn't get along super well with the guy who runs the Renaissance fair, but then their characters go through a hand-fasted ceremony and are kind of flirting with each other, and then sparks fly in real life as well, and it's really freaking adorable. And I loved it a whole lot. So yeah, definitely a new favorite. So glad I read this. Highly recommend. Really cute. All right, so that is it. Those are the 31 books that I read in August. Wow, it was a lot. I did a lot of reading in August, and it was an interesting month. If you made it this far, congrats. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on any of the books that I read or things that I talked about. For your question of the day, let me know if you are a romance reader, and if so, what is your trope? Like, what is the thing that you always love in romance? Because clearly one of mine is geeky characters. I love it so much. And it's probably because I'm geeky and my husband is geeky, and it just makes me really, really happy. So yeah, there you go. Talk to me in the comments down below. If you guys liked this video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.